In a world where social media likes determine worth and celebrity status equals importance, we often overlook the quiet heroes walking among us. They serve our coffee, clean our offices, and go about their daily lives invisible to those around them. But what happens when one of these forgotten souls carries a secret so profound that it takes a 4-star general salute to reveal the truth? This is the story of Maria Santos, a 52-year-old night shift janitor who scrubbed floors in a downtown office building for 12 years. Every night, she arrived at 11 p.m. sharp, her worn uniform pressed, and her graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Business people rushed past her without a glance. Security guards barely acknowledged her presence. To the world, she was just another face in the crowd of invisible workers keeping society running. But Maria carried within her a story that would leave an entire nation speechless. A story of courage that spanned decades, of sacrifices that saved lives, and of heroism that went unrecognized until one fateful evening when the past and present collided in the most unexpected way. Sometimes the greatest heroes are hiding in plain sight, waiting for their moment of recognition. Sometimes it takes a general to remind us that true valor doesn't always wear uniform or march in parades. And sometimes the most powerful salute is the one that comes 23 years too late. Maria Santos pushed her car down the marble hallway of the Meridian Tower, the wheels squeaking softly in the silence of the empty building. At 52, she had perfected the art of being invisible. Her movements were quiet and efficient, her presence barely registering to the few late-working executives who occasionally crossed her path. The clock on the wall showed 11:45 p.m. as she began cleaning the executive floor. This was her routine, night after night, for the past 12 years. She would start with the bathrooms, move to the conference rooms, then finish with the individual offices. Each task performed with meticulous care, though no one would notice if she missed a spot or two. As she emptied waste baskets and wiped down surfaces, Maria's mind often wandered to memories she kept locked away. Tonight was no different. The silence of the building seemed to amplify the echoes of her past, bringing back images she had spent decades trying to forget. She paused at the large window overlooking the city lights. Somewhere out there, in apartments and houses scattered across the metropolitan area, were families sleeping peacefully, children dreaming of tomorrow's adventures, parents planning weekend trips and school events. Normal lives, untouched by the kind of darkness Maria had once known intimately. The sound of footsteps in the hallway broke her reverie. She quickly returned to her work, becoming invisible once again as a late-working lawyer passed by without acknowledgement. This was how it always was. She was furniture to these people, part of the building's infrastructure rather than a human being with a story worth knowing. Maria had learned to accept this invisibility. In many ways, she preferred it. Attention brought questions, and questions led to conversations she wasn't ready to have. For 23 years, she had built a carefully constructed life of anonymity, working jobs that required no background checks beyond basic criminal history, living in small apartments where neighbors kept to themselves. Her colleagues at the cleaning company knew her as a reliable, quiet woman who never missed a shift and never caused trouble. She arrived on time, did her work thoroughly, and went home to her small studio apartment where she lived alone with her cat, Esperanza. Hope. The name was a cruel irony, considering how little hope Maria had carried in her heart for so long. But tonight felt different somehow. There was an electricity in the air, a sense that something was about to shift. Maria had learned to trust these instincts long ago, during a time when sensing danger could mean the difference between life and death. She moved to the conference room at the end of the hall, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. As she cleaned the long mahogany table where important business decisions were made daily, she couldn't help but think about the decisions she had once been forced to make. Decisions that had saved lives, but cost her everything she had once held dear. The building's security guard, Jimmy, appeared in the doorway. He was one of the few people who actually spoke to her during her shifts, though their conversations rarely went beyond pleasantries about the weather or complaints about particularly messy offices. Working late tonight, Mrs. Santos, he said, using the formal address she had always insisted upon. She had never told him her real name wasn't Santos, just as she had never corrected the assumption that she was or had been married. Always working, Jimmy, she replied with a small smile. Sleep is for people with clean consciences. It was meant as a joke, but Jimmy caught something in her tone that made him pause. He studied her face for a moment, noting the sadness that seemed permanently etched around her dark eyes. You know, in all the years you've worked here, I don't think I know anything about you, he said. Do you have family? Kids? Maria's hands stilled on the cleaning cloth. The question was innocent enough, but it touched on the wound that had never fully healed. She had learned long ago that the safest response to personal questions was deflection. Family's complicated, Jimmy. Sometimes it's better to leave the past where it belongs. But as she spoke those words, Maria felt the familiar ache in her chest. The past wasn't something that could be left behind like an old photograph in a drawer. It lived in her bones, in a way she unconsciously checked exits in every room she entered, in the nightmares that still visited her sleep after all these years. She had been many things in her life before becoming Maria Santos, the invisible janitor. She had been a daughter, a sister, a student with dreams of becoming a teacher. She had been a young woman in love, planning a wedding that would never happen. She had been a fighter, a survivor, a hero whose actions had saved countless lives. Most importantly, she had been Elena Rodriguez, a name that once meant something in certain circles, a name that could never be spoken aloud again. The transformation from Elena to Maria hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual process of burying one identity so deeply that sometimes she almost forgot it had ever existed. New documents, a new social security number, a new history carefully constructed to hide the truth of what she had done and why she could never go home again. She had chosen the name Santos because it meant saints in Spanish, though she had never felt particularly saintly. If anything, she felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of other people's lives without ever truly belonging anywhere. As Jimmy continued his rounds and the building returned to its late-night quiet, Maria found herself thinking about the letter hidden in her apartment. It had arrived 3 weeks ago, forwarded through a chain of contacts she had hoped never to hear from again. The return address was from the Department of Defense, and though she hadn't opened it yet, she could guess what it contained. After 23 years, someone had remembered. Someone was looking for Elena Rodriguez, the woman who had disappeared one night in 1998, taking with her secrets that could have changed the course of history. Maria finished cleaning the conference room and moved on to the executive offices. In a corner office belonging to the company's CEO, she paused at the wall of photographs. Pictures of the man shaking hands with politicians, receiving awards, posing with celebrities. A life lived in the spotlight, documented and celebrated. She tried to imagine what her own wall would look like if she had chosen a different path. Pictures with fellow journalists covering important stories. Maybe a Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. A wedding photo with Carlos, the man she had loved and lost. Pictures of the children they might have had, growing up in a world where their mother could use her real name. Instead, her apartment walls were bare except for a single photograph of her parents, taken shortly before they died in a car accident when she was 19. It was the only connection to Elena Rodriguez she had allowed herself to keep, hidden behind the frame of an unremarkable landscape she had bought at a thrift store. The night wore on, and Maria continued her methodical cleaning. Each room told a story of the people who worked there during the day. The executive who kept a photo of his family on his desk, but stayed late every night. The young associate who had pictures from a recent wedding, but ate lunch alone. The senior partner who had motivational quotes covering his bulletin board, but seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. These fragments of other people's lives had become Maria's entertainment during the long nights. She created narratives about their dreams and struggles, their successes and failures. It was easier than thinking too deeply about her own story, the one that had no happy ending in sight. As she cleaned the last office on the floor, Maria's phone buzzed with a text message. She rarely received messages, and her heart jumped with the familiar spike of anxiety that accompanied any unexpected contact. The message was from her supervisor at the cleaning company. Need you to work extra shift tomorrow night. Building hosting military ceremony. VIP event. Time and half pay. Maria stared at the message for a long moment. A military ceremony. After 23 years of carefully avoiding anything connected to the armed forces, fate seemed to be pushing her directly into harm's way. She could refuse the assignment, make up an excuse about being sick or having a family emergency. But the extra money would help, and besides, she was just a janitor. No one would notice her any more at a military event than they did on any other night. As she typed her acceptance of the assignment, Maria felt the weight of inevitability settling over her like a heavy blanket. Some part of her had always known this day would come, the day when Elena Rodriguez would be forced to surface, even if only for a moment. She finished her shift and gathered her supplies, wheeling her cart toward the service elevator. Tomorrow night, she would return to clean up after the celebration, invisible as always among the crowd of distinguished guests and decorated officers. What she couldn't know was that among those officers would be a four-star general who had spent the last 2 decades wondering what happened to a brave young journalist who had risked everything to expose a scandal that could have destroyed careers and endangered lives. A general who had never forgotten the woman who had disappeared before he could properly thank her for her service to her country. A general who was about to recognize a face he had been hoping to see again for 23 years. Elena Rodriguez had been 28 years old when her life changed forever. It was September 1998, and she was working as an investigative journalist for the San Antonio Express-News, covering military affairs and defense contracts. She had built a reputation for thorough reporting and fearless pursuit of the truth, qualities that would ultimately save lives and destroy her own future. The story that would change everything began with a seemingly routine tip from a whistleblower at Fort Sam Houston. A maintenance worker had noticed irregularities in the storage and handling of chemical weapons materials. What started as a potential safety violation story quickly evolved into something much more sinister. Elena spent weeks following leads, conducting interviews, and piecing together a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of military command. A group of officers were illegally selling surplus chemical weapons to foreign buyers, falsifying inventory reports, and covering up security breaches that had already resulted in 1 civilian death. The deeper she dug, the more dangerous her situation became. Anonymous phone calls warned her to drop the investigation. Her car tires were slashed. Someone broke into her apartment, though nothing was stolen. The message was clear: back off or face the consequences. But Elena had never been one to back down from a fight. She had grown up in a family of activists, watching her parents fight for workers' rights and social justice. Her father had always told her that the truth was worth any sacrifice, even if the cost was personal. As her investigation progressed, Elena realized she had uncovered something that could prevent a major terrorist attack. Intelligence suggested that the chemical weapons sold by the corrupt officers were being prepared for use against civilian targets in the United States. Time was running out, and the normal channels of journalism were too slow. She made the decision that would save hundreds of lives, but exile her from her own existence. Elena contacted General William Harrison, then a 2-star general who had been trying to clean up corruption in the chemical weapons program. She arranged to meet him secretly and turn over all her evidence. The meeting took place on a rainy October night in a parking garage downtown. Elena handed over boxes of documents, photographs, and recorded interviews. She had enough evidence to bring down the entire conspiracy and prevent the planned attack. General Harrison studied the materials with growing alarm. Elena had uncovered something his own investigators had missed, connections that painted a picture of corruption and treason that went far beyond what anyone had suspected. "Ms. Rodriguez, you understand what this means?" he had asked, his voice grave. "These men won't hesitate to kill to protect themselves. The moment this goes public, your life will be in danger." Elena had expected this. She had already made arrangements to disappear if necessary. New identity documents were waiting, money had been moved to untraceable accounts, and she had a plan to vanish without leaving any trail back to her loved ones. "I understand, General, but if I don't come forward, people will die. That's not something I can live with." The general had looked at her with a mixture of admiration and sadness. "You're saving lives tonight, Ms. Rodriguez. Your country owes you a debt it can never properly repay. Within 72 hours, the conspiracy was exposed. Military raids seized the remaining chemical weapons, arrests were made, and the planned terrorist attack was prevented. The official story released to the media credited an ongoing military investigation with uncovering the plot, making no mention of Elena's role. By the time the arrests were made public, Elena Rodriguez had ceased to exist. The woman who had risked everything for the truth had vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the memory of her courage and the lives she had saved. The transformation into Maria Santos had been carefully planned, but emotionally devastating. Elena's parents were already dead, which made the disappearance easier, but more lonely. She had been forced to break up with Carlos, the man she loved, without explanation. She simply disappeared one night, leaving only a note saying she had to go and couldn't explain why. The hardest part had been staying hidden while watching the aftermath of her revelations. She read every newspaper article about the conspiracy, watched every television report, and saw how her work was credited to others. The general had kept his word about protecting her identity, but it meant she could never claim credit for the most important work of her life. Years passed in a blur of menial jobs and careful anonymity. Elena Rodriguez became a ghost, existing only in classified files and the memories of the few people who knew the truth. Maria Santos was born from necessity, a woman with no past and no connections to the person she used to be. The loneliness was crushing at times. She wanted to contact Carlos to explain why she had left, but any communication could put him in danger. She wanted to visit her parents' graves on their anniversary, but Elena Rodriguez was supposed to be dead. She wanted to continue her journalism career, but any attempt to write under her real name would expose her location. Instead, she took jobs that required no background checks, no references, no connections to her former life. She cleaned offices, worked in factories, served food in diners. Always jobs where she could blend into the background, where no one would ask too many questions about her past. The worst part was the knowledge that her sacrifice had been largely forgotten. The terrorist plot she helped prevent never made major headlines because the government couldn't reveal how close it had come to succeeding. The corrupt officers were quietly court-martialed and imprisoned, but the full scope of the conspiracy remained classified. Maria often wondered if anyone remembered Elena Rodriguez. Did General Harrison ever think about the journalist who had saved so many lives? Did Carlos ever wonder what happened to the woman he loved? Did anyone in the journalism community notice that a promising investigative reporter had simply vanished? The letter that had arrived 3 weeks ago suggested that at least one person remembered. The Department of Defense envelope had sat unopened on her kitchen table, too dangerous to read, but impossible to throw away. Maria knew that opening it would mean the end of her carefully constructed anonymity, but ignoring it felt like betraying the memory of the woman she used to be. Tonight, as she prepared for her regular shift, Maria finally found the courage to read the letter. Her hands shook as she tore open the envelope and unfolded the official letterhead. Dear M.S. Rodriguez, it began, confirming that someone knew exactly who she was and where she had been hiding. I am writing to inform you that the Department of Defense will be presenting a special recognition award for your service to your country during the events of October 1998. General William Harrison, now retired, has requested that you be present to receive this honor. The letter went on to explain that the award ceremony would be held at the Meridian Tower, the very building where Maria had been working as a janitor for the past 12 years. The irony was so perfect it felt like the universe playing a cosmic joke. General Harrison, now bearing 4 stars and nearing retirement, wanted to publicly thank the woman who had saved countless lives. He had been searching for Elena Rodriguez for years, tracking her through a network of contacts and favors until he finally located the woman living under the name Maria Santos. The ceremony was scheduled for tomorrow night, the same night Maria was supposed to work the extra shift. She would be in the building, invisible as always, while her former self was being honored just floors above. Maria stared at the letter for a long time, trying to process the implications. After 23 years of hiding, someone wanted to drag Elena Rodriguez back into the light. The recognition she had always dreamed of was finally being offered, but accepting it would mean the end of the safe, anonymous life she had built. She thought about General Harrison, the man who had promised to protect her all those years ago. He had kept her secret, but now he wanted to share her story with the world. Did he understand what he was asking of her? Did he know that Maria Santos would have to die for Elena Rodriguez to live again? The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. It was her supervisor at the cleaning company, confirming the details for tomorrow night's assignment. It's a big event, Maria. Some kind of military ceremony. They want extra security, which means you'll need to be extra careful about staying out of the way. Just do your job, and don't bother the guests. Of course, Maria replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her mind. I always stay invisible. As she hung up the phone, Maria realized she had a choice to make. She could work her shift tomorrow night and watch from the shadows as Elena Rodriguez was honored in absentia. She could continue living as Maria Santos, safe and anonymous, but forever separate from her true identity. Or she could find the courage to step back into the light, to reclaim the life she had sacrificed for the greater good, and, finally, receive the recognition she had earned through 23 years of exile. The decision would change everything, but Maria had never been one to back down from a fight. Elena Rodriguez had been willing to risk everything for the truth, and perhaps it was time for Maria Santos to show the same courage. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her purse. Tomorrow night, she would return to the Meridian Tower for what might be the most important shift of her life. Whether she emerged as Maria Santos or Elena Rodriguez would depend on a split-second decision that could reshape her entire future. For the first time in 23 years, she allowed herself to hope that the exile might finally be coming to an end. The woman who had saved so many lives was about to discover whether there was still room in the world for heroes who preferred the shadows to the spotlight. Maria arrived at the Meridian Tower on Friday evening to find the building transformed. Security personnel flanked every entrance. Metal detectors had been installed in the lobby, and men in dress uniforms moved through the hallways with purposeful efficiency. The contrast between this military precision and her usual quiet workplace was jarring. She checked in with building security, showing the same employee identification badge she had carried for 12 years. The guards barely glanced at her, focused instead on screening the distinguished guests beginning to arrive for the ceremony. To them, she was just another member of the invisible workforce that kept the building running. Jimmy, the night security guard, gave her a knowing look as she collected her cleaning supplies. Big night tonight, Mrs. Santos. Lots of important people coming through. Best to keep your head down and stay out of their way. Always do, Jimmy, Maria replied, though her heart was racing with anticipation and fear. She wondered if he would still call her Mrs. Santos if he knew who she really was. As she began her rounds on the lower floors, Maria could hear the sounds of preparation echoing from the penthouse conference center. Catering staff rushed back, and, forth with trays of food, florists arranged elaborate displays, and event coordinators spoke in urgent whispers about timing and protocol. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 8 o'clock, which meant Maria would be working her way up through the building as the evening progressed. By the time the main event started, she would be cleaning the floors just below the penthouse, close enough to hear the speeches but far enough away to remain invisible. She moved through her routine with automatic efficiency, but her mind was completely focused on the decision that lay ahead. The letter in her purse felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, and every time she passed a military officer in the hallway, her pulse quickened. At 7:30, Maria found herself cleaning the executive floor directly below the penthouse. Through the ceiling, she could hear the murmur of conversation as guests arrived and mingled. Occasionally, a burst of laughter or the clink of glasses filtered down, reminders of the celebration happening just above her head. She was emptying wastebaskets in the corner office when she heard a familiar voice in the hallway. Even after 23 years, she recognized the authoritative tone and measured cadence of General William Harrison. He was older now, his voice carrying the weight of decades of leadership, but it was unmistakably the same man who had met her in that parking garage so long ago. The ceremony should begin in 15 minutes, she heard him say to an aide. Have you confirmed that all the honorees are present? Yes, sir. All except for the final recipient. Ms. Rodriguez hasn't responded to our invitation. Maria pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear every word. I was afraid of that, General Harrison replied. 23 years is a long time to stay hidden. She might not feel safe coming forward, even now. Should we proceed without her, sir? There was a long pause before the general answered. We'll present the award in her honor, whether she's here or not. What she did saved hundreds of lives. The least we can do is ensure her sacrifice is recognized, even if she can't be here to accept the honor herself. The voices faded as the group moved toward the elevator, leaving Maria alone with her thoughts. General Harrison was going to honor Elena Rodriguez tonight, with or without her presence. He was going to tell the story of a journalist who had risked everything for the truth, a woman who had disappeared into the shadows to protect herself and others. Maria finished cleaning the office and moved to the supply closet, where she stood in the darkness trying to process what she had just heard. After all these years, someone was going to tell her story. Not the sanitized version that had appeared in classified reports, but the human story of sacrifice and courage. She thought about Carlos, who might be watching the ceremony on television without knowing that the woman being honored was the same person who had vanished from his life without explanation. She thought about her former colleagues at the newspaper, who might finally understand what happened to the promising young reporter who had simply disappeared. The sound of the elevator opening brought her back to the present. Maria quickly gathered her supplies and moved to the next office, maintaining her invisible presence as military personnel continued to move through the building. At 8 o'clock, she could hear General Harrison's voice beginning the ceremony. The acoustics in the old building carried sound surprisingly well, and Maria found herself able to follow most of the proceedings from her position on the floor below. Ladies and gentlemen, we gather tonight to honor individuals whose service to our country has often gone unrecognized. These men and women risked their lives not for glory or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Maria continued cleaning, but her attention was completely focused on the words drifting down from above. Other awards were presented first, each with a story of heroism and sacrifice. She found herself moved by these tales of ordinary people who had done extraordinary things in service to their country. Then, she heard her name. Our final honoree tonight is someone who embodies the highest ideals of journalism and citizenship. In October 1998, Elena Rodriguez, an investigative reporter for the San Antonio Express-News, uncovered a conspiracy that threatened the safety of countless American civilians. Maria stopped cleaning and sat down heavily in a desk chair, her hands trembling as she listened to her own story being told to a room full of distinguished guests. Ms. Rodriguez discovered that a group of corrupt military officers were illegally selling chemical weapons to foreign buyers with terrorist connections. These weapons were destined for use against civilian targets within the United States. Her investigation prevented what would have been one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in our nation's history. The room was completely silent as General Harrison continued. Maria could picture the faces of the audience, learning for the first time about events that had been classified for over 2 decades. When Ms. Rodriguez realized the scope of the threat, she made the difficult decision to come forward with her evidence, knowing that doing so would put her own life in danger. She turned over months of investigative work to military authorities, providing the critical intelligence needed to prevent the attack and apprehend the conspirators. Maria felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to the recognition she had never expected to receive. Because of the sensitive nature of this operation and the ongoing threats to her safety, Ms. Rodriguez was forced to disappear from public life. For 23 years, she has lived in exile, unable to claim credit for her work or continue the journalism career she loved. She sacrificed her identity, her relationships, and her dreams to save the lives of people she would never meet. General Harrison's voice took on a personal tone as he continued. I had the privilege of working with Ms. Rodriguez during this operation. Her courage and integrity were extraordinary, and I have never forgotten the debt our nation owes to her sacrifice. The general paused, and Maria could hear him taking a deep breath before continuing. Ms. Rodriguez, if you're listening tonight, I want you to know that your service has not been forgotten. You are a hero in the truest sense of the word, and it's time for your story to be told. Maria stood up slowly, her decision crystallizing in that moment. For 23 years, she had lived in the shadows, protecting herself and others by remaining invisible. But tonight, surrounded by the sounds of her own recognition, she realized that hiding had become its own form of prison. Elena Rodriguez had been willing to sacrifice everything for the truth. Perhaps it was time for Maria Santos to show the same courage. She walked to the service elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse floor. As the elevator rose, she felt like she was traveling not just through the building, but through time itself, returning to a life she had abandoned long ago. The elevator doors opened to reveal a hallway lined with military honor guards. Beyond them, she could see into the conference room where the ceremony was taking place. General Harrison stood at a podium, a medal resting on the table beside him. Maria took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway. Her uniform and cleaning supplies marked her as staff, and the honor guards barely glanced at her as she moved toward the conference room. She paused at the entrance, looking in at the assembled crowd of military officers, government officials, and distinguished guests. These were people accustomed to ceremonies and protocol, to order and hierarchy. The appearance of a janitor would disrupt the careful choreography of the evening. But Maria was no longer thinking about disruption or protocol. She was thinking about the young woman who had risked everything for the truth and the recognition that was finally within reach. General Harrison was concluding his remarks about Elena Rodriguez when Maria stepped into the room. At first, no one noticed the small woman in the cleaning uniform standing at the back of the gathering. She was invisible, as she had been for 23 years. Then, General Harrison looked up from his notes and saw her face. His eyes widened in recognition, and his prepared remarks died on his lips. He stared at her for a long moment, as if seeing a ghost from his past. "Elena," he said softly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence of the room. Every head in the room turned to look at the janitor standing in the doorway. Maria felt the weight of their attention like a physical force, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she walked slowly toward the front of the room, her head held high. "My name is Elena Rodriguez," she said, her voice clear and steady, "and I'm here to accept my medal." The room erupted in surprised murmurs and confused whispers. Who was this woman? How had she gotten past security? What was happening to their carefully planned ceremony? But General Harrison understood immediately. The woman he had been searching for had been hiding in plain sight, working in the very building where her heroism was being honored. The invisible janitor was the legendary journalist whose story he had just finished telling. As Maria walked toward the podium, 23 years of exile began to fall away. She was no longer Maria Santos, the woman who cleaned offices and lived in the shadows. She was Elena Rodriguez, the investigative reporter who had saved countless lives and was finally ready to reclaim her place in the world. The general stepped forward to meet her, his face showing a mixture of amazement and deep respect. In his hand was the medal that had been waiting 23 years to find its rightful recipient. The moment that would change everything was about to begin. The conference room fell into absolute silence as Maria approached the podium. 200 of the nation's most distinguished military officers and government officials stared in stunned amazement at the small woman in a janitor's uniform who claimed to be the legendary Elena Rodriguez. General Harrison stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Maria's face. Up close, he could see the changes 23 years had brought. Her dark hair was streaked with silver, lines of hardship etched around her eyes, and her hands showed the wear of years of manual labor. But beneath these marks of time, he recognized the same intelligent eyes and determined expression of the young journalist who had saved so many lives. "Elena Rodriguez," he said softly, his voice filled with wonder. "After all these years, you've been here all along." "I've been hiding in plain sight, General," Maria replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Sometimes the best place to disappear is right in front of everyone." The audience watched in fascination as this unprecedented scene unfolded. Military ceremonies were known for their precision and predictability, but nothing in the protocol manual had prepared them for this moment. General Harrison turned to address the confused crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Elena Rodriguez, the woman whose story I just shared with you. She has been working in this very building as a member of the custodial staff, unknown to any of us until this moment." A wave of murmurs swept through the room. The idea that a national hero had been cleaning their offices for years, invisible and unrecognized, was almost impossible to process. Secretary of Defense Margaret Walsh, who had been seated in the front row, stood up slowly. She was a formidable woman, known for her no-nonsense approach to military affairs, but her expression showed genuine amazement. "Ms. Rodriguez, is this really true? Have you been working here all this time?" Maria nodded, feeling the weight of decades of secrecy finally lifting from her shoulders. "For 12 years, I've cleaned these offices every night. I've emptied your wastebaskets, dusted your desks, and mopped your floors. You've all walked past me countless times without seeing me." The implications of her words hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. How many times had they rushed past her in the hallway, too busy or too important to acknowledge the woman who kept their workplace clean? How many of them had stepped around her card or ignored her presence, never imagining they were in the presence of someone who had sacrificed everything for their country? General Harrison picked up the medal from the table beside the podium. It was the Distinguished Public Service Award, the highest honor the Department of Defense could bestow on a civilian. The inscription read, "For extraordinary courage and sacrifice in service to the United States of America. Elena Rodriguez," he said formally, "by the authority vested in me by the Secretary of Defense and the United States Army, I present you with this award in recognition of your heroic actions in October 1998. Your courage prevented a catastrophic terrorist attack and saved hundreds of innocent lives." As he pinned the medal to Maria's uniform, the general's hands trembled slightly. This was more than just another award ceremony. It was the culmination of a 23-year search for justice and recognition. But what happened next would become the moment that defined not just Elena's return to public life, but also a fundamental shift in how the nation viewed the invisible heroes working among them. General Harrison stepped back from Maria and, in a gesture that shocked everyone in the room, came to attention and rendered a slow, deliberate salute. A 4-star general, one of the most powerful men in the American military, was saluting a woman in a janitor's uniform. The symbolism was unmistakable and profound. It wasn't just recognition of Elena's past heroism. It was an acknowledgement of the dignity and worth of every person who served others through honest work, regardless of their position in society's hierarchy. One by one, every military officer in the room stood and saluted. Colonels and majors, admirals and captains, all rendering honors to a woman they had passed by in hallways without a second glance. The civilian officials stood as well, placing their hands over their hearts in respect. Maria felt tears streaming down her face as she looked out at the sea of salutes. For 23 years, she had lived invisible and unacknowledged. Now, in this moment, she was receiving the recognition she had never dared hope for. But the ceremony wasn't over yet. General Harrison had one more surprise. "Ms. Rodriguez, there are some people here tonight who have been waiting a long time to see you again." From a side entrance, 3 people walked into the room. Maria's breath caught in her throat as she recognized them. Her former editor from the San Antonio Express-News, her photographer partner from the investigation, and, most incredibly, Carlos Mendoza, the man she had loved and left without explanation. Carlos looked exactly as she remembered him, though his dark hair was now completely gray and his face showed the lines of a man who had spent decades wondering what happened to the woman he loved. When their eyes met across the room, 23 years collapsed into nothing. "Elena," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the continuing applause. "I never stopped believing you were alive somewhere." The reunion that followed was unlike anything the military attendees had ever witnessed at an official ceremony. Carlos crossed the room and embraced Elena, both of them crying openly as years of separation and unanswered questions finally came to an end. Her former colleagues from the newspaper were equally emotional. Tom Bradley, her editor, shook his head in amazement as he looked at the woman who had once been his most promising reporter. "We knew something had happened to you," he said. "You were investigating something big, and then you just vanished. We filed missing person reports, hired private investigators, but you had disappeared completely." "I had to," Elena replied, her voice thick with emotion. "If I had stayed, people would have died. If I had contacted any of you, it would have put you in danger too." The photographer, Sarah Chun, pulled out a small device and showed Elena a message that had been recorded weeks earlier. "When we heard about tonight's ceremony, we reached out to everyone who had worked with you. We wanted you to know what your sacrifice meant to all of us." The device played a video compilation of messages from Elena's former colleagues, friends from college, and fellow journalists who had followed her work. Each person shared memories of the brilliant, fearless reporter who had inspired them, and many expressed regret that her story had remained untold for so long. But it was Carlos who provided the most emotional moment of the evening. Standing before the assembled crowd, he addressed the woman he had never stopped loving. "Elena, when you disappeared, I thought I had lost you forever. I've spent 23 years wondering if I did something wrong, if there was something I could have done differently. Now I understand that you left not because you didn't love me, but because you loved your country and innocent people more than your own safety." He paused, struggling to control his emotions. "I want you to know that I never married. I never stopped hoping that someday you would come home. And if you'll have me, I'd like to spend whatever time we have left making up for the years we lost." The room was completely silent as Elena considered his words. 23 years ago, she had walked away from everything she loved to save the lives of strangers. Tonight, she was being offered the chance to reclaim the life she had sacrificed. "Carlos," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I never stopped loving you either. Not for a single day." The embrace that followed brought tears to the eyes of hardened military veterans who had seen combat in multiple theaters of war. This was more than just a reunion. It was the restoration of a life that had been interrupted by duty and sacrifice. As the evening wound down, Elena found herself surrounded by people eager to shake her hand and hear her story. The transformation from invisible janitor to celebrated hero was complete, but she realized that the real work was just beginning. General Harrison approached her as the crowd began to disperse. "Elena, I have a proposition for you. The Department of Defense needs someone with your skills and experience to head up a new initiative on whistleblower protection and national security journalism. It would be a chance to use your talents in service of your country once again, but this time with full recognition and support." Elena looked around the room at the faces of people who had once ignored her, but now saw her as a hero. She thought about the long nights of cleaning offices, the years of anonymity and loneliness, and the courage it had taken to step forward tonight. "General, I'm honored by your offer, but I need time to think about what comes next. For 23 years, I've lived one day at a time. Now I need to figure out how to live a whole life again." As the ceremony officially concluded and guests began to leave, Elena stood at the window overlooking the city where she had spent so many years in exile. Tomorrow, her story would be front-page news around the world. The invisible janitor who turned out to be a national hero would become a symbol of unrecognized sacrifice and courage. But tonight, for the first time in 23 years, Elena Rodriguez was no longer alone. She was surrounded by people who knew her true identity and valued her sacrifice. The exile was over, and the real journey was just beginning. 3 months after the ceremony that changed her life, Elena Rodriguez stood in the newsroom of the Washington Post, looking out at a sea of reporters who had gathered to hear her speak. The invitation to address the National Press Club had come with some trepidation, but Elena knew it was time to tell her complete story to the people who would understand it best. The past few months have been a whirlwind of media attention, government meetings, and personal adjustments. The story of the janitor who was secretly a national hero had captured the public imagination in ways Elena never anticipated. Her photo had appeared on magazine covers, her story had been featured in documentaries, and she had received thousands of letters from people around the world who were inspired by her sacrifice. But perhaps the most meaningful change had been personal. She and Carlos had spent the past 3 months getting to know each other again, rebuilding a relationship that had been frozen in time for over 2 decades. They had decided to take things slowly, understanding that 23 years apart couldn't be erased overnight, but the love that had brought them together originally still burned strong. Elena had also reconnected with her journalistic roots. She had taken the position offered by General Harrison, but on her own terms. Instead of working within the traditional military structure, she had established an independent foundation focused on protecting whistleblowers and supporting investigative journalism that served the public interest. The Elena Rodriguez Foundation had already helped a dozen journalists who were facing retaliation for exposing corruption or misconduct. It provided legal support, financial assistance, and, most importantly, safe channels for reporters who found themselves in situations similar to what Elena had faced in 1998. Now, standing before her journalistic peers, Elena was ready to share the lessons she had learned during her long exile and dramatic return to public life. When I walked into that ceremony 3 months ago, she began, her voice clear and confident. I thought I was simply reclaiming my identity. I didn't realize I was starting a conversation about the invisible people who keep our society running. The audience of seasoned reporters listened intently as Elena described the irony of her situation. A national hero working unnoticed in a building full of people who would have been fascinated by her story if they had only bothered to see her as a human being. For 12 years, I cleaned the offices of some of the most important people in the city. I had security clearances higher than some of the executives whose wastebaskets I emptied, but because I wore a uniform and pushed a cart, I was invisible to them. Elena's voice took on a passionate intensity as she continued. But here's what I learned during those years. Every person you pass in the hallway has a story. Every janitor, every security guard, every cafeteria worker has experiences and wisdom that could enrich your understanding of the world. The tragedy isn't just that my story went untold. It's that we ignore thousands of stories every day because we don't see the storytellers. The speech was being broadcast live on multiple news networks, and social media was already buzzing with reactions. The hashtag See the Invisible had begun trending as people shared stories of overlooked heroes in their own communities. Following Elena's example, news organizations across the country had begun featuring stories about the unsung heroes working in plain sight. The janitor at Chicago General Hospital who had a PhD in engineering from his home country, but couldn't afford to have his credentials recognized. The restaurant busboy in Los Angeles who was actually a published poet in Spanish. The office cleaner in Miami who had been a judge in Cuba before fleeing political persecution. The foundation work was challenging and meaningful, allowing her to combine her journalistic experience with her hard-earned understanding of how to operate in dangerous situations. More importantly, she was finally able to grieve properly for the life she had lost. With the support of Carlos and her rediscovered community of colleagues, Elena was working through the trauma of her forced exile. She was learning to reconcile Elena Rodriguez, the hero, with Maria Santos, the survivor. I want to address something that many of you have asked me about. Elena continued her speech. People want to know if I regret the choice I made in 1998. They ask if I would do it again, knowing what I know now about the cost. She paused, looking out at the faces of reporters who had dedicated their lives to pursuing truth, many of whom had faced their own professional and personal costs for their commitment to journalism. I regret the circumstances that made that choice necessary. I regret a corrupt system that forced me to choose between my safety and my duty as a journalist. I regret the 23 years that Carlos and I lost together, the career I couldn't continue, the relationships I couldn't maintain. Her voice grew stronger. But I don't regret the choice itself. Hundreds of people are alive today because of that decision. Families got to go home that night instead of becoming victims of a terrorist attack. That's worth 23 years of anonymity. That's worth a lifetime of sacrifice. The audience erupted in applause, but Elena raised her hand for silence. However, I refuse to accept that such extreme sacrifice should be necessary. That's why the foundation exists. We need better systems to protect people who come forward with important information. We need a society that values truth-telling over institutional protection. And We need to recognize that heroism comes in many forms, not just the dramatic gestures that make headlines. As Elena concluded her speech, she announced the Foundation's latest initiative, a scholarship program for investigative journalists from backgrounds traditionally underrepresented in newsrooms. The program would specifically target students from working-class families, immigrants, and others whose perspectives have been missing from American journalism. We need reporters who understand what it's like to be invisible, Elena explained. People who won't walk past the janitor without seeing the potential story, the human dignity, the wealth of experience that every person carries. After the speech, Elena was surrounded by reporters eager to ask follow-up questions, but she noticed one person hanging back from the crowd. It was Jimmy, the night security guard from the Meridian Tower, dressed in his best suit and looking somewhat overwhelmed by the prestigious surroundings. Elena excused herself from the other reporters and approached him with a warm smile. "Jimmy, I wasn't expecting to see you here. Ms. Rodriguez. I wanted to hear what you had to say. After finding out who you really were, I started thinking about all the conversations we had over the years. You were always so kind to me, always treated me like I mattered." Elena felt tears forming in her eyes. "You do matter, Jimmy. You've always mattered. I hope you know that. I wanted to thank you," he continued, his voice emotional. "Not for the big hero stuff, though that's incredible. I wanted to thank you for being one of the few people in that building who ever really saw me, who talked to me like I was a person, not just part of the furniture." This conversation, more than all the media attention and official recognition, reminded Elena why her story mattered. It wasn't just about one journalist's heroism. It was about the fundamental human dignity that connected all people, regardless of their job titles or social status. 6 months later, Elena and Carlos were married in a small ceremony attended by family, friends, and several of the people whose lives have been touched by Elena's story. General Harrison served as an honorary groomsman, and the ceremony was held in the same conference room where Elena had reclaimed her identity. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Jimmy, now promoted to head of security at the Meridian Tower, walked Elena down the aisle. It was a symbolic gesture that represented the bridge between her old life and her new one, between the invisible woman she had been and the recognized hero she had become. In her wedding speech, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 23 years ago, I thought I was giving up everything for a principle. I thought I was trading my life for the safety of strangers. What I discovered is that sometimes you have to lose yourself completely before you can truly find out who you're meant to be." She looked around the room at the faces of people who had supported her journey back to the light. "I learned that heroism isn't about grand gestures or public recognition. It's about choosing to do the right thing even when no one is watching, even when no one will ever know. It's about seeing the dignity in every person you meet and treating them accordingly." Elena paused, her voice thick with emotion. "But I also learned that heroes shouldn't have to remain invisible, that sacrifice shouldn't require exile, and that every person, no matter what job they do or where they come from, deserves to be seen, to be valued, and to have their story told." As Elena and Carlos danced their first dance as a married couple, the room was filled with people whose lives had been changed by her story. Journalists who now approached their work with greater awareness of the invisible people around them. Military officers who had gained new appreciation for the civilians who served alongside them in their own ways. Government officials who were working to create better protection for whistleblowers and truth-tellers. Most importantly, the room was filled with ordinary people who had been inspired to look more closely at the unsung heroes in their own communities, to recognize that extraordinary courage often wears ordinary clothes, and that the most important stories are sometimes hiding in plain sight. Elena Rodriguez had spent 23 years invisible, cleaning up after others while her own story remained untold. Now, as she stepped into her new life, she carried with her the wisdom of those years in exile and the determination to ensure that no other hero would have to remain invisible for so long. The janitor had received her salute, but more importantly, she had sparked a movement that would help countless others step out of the shadows and into the recognition they deserved. In the end, that might be the greatest heroism of all. Not just being willing to sacrifice yourself for others, but helping to build a world where such extreme sacrifice is no longer necessary. The Invisible Woman had finally come home, and in doing so, she had helped make the invisible visible for countless others. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who use their moment in the spotlight to shine that light on everyone else who has been waiting in the shadows, hoping to be seen.